Glad to have all of you here this evening. So, last week we were continuing our series on the Sermon on the Mount, which is what we're doing tonight as well. And we started to get into really the bulk of the Sermon on the Mount and talked about one of the more difficult sections in the whole sermon, which is Jesus talking about fulfilling the law rather than coming to abolish it. And the way he took the Old Testament Jewish law and both lived it out perfectly and therefore allowed us to be justified through him, and also revealed to us the perfected image of those commandments. And so those are the two ways in which Jesus fulfills the law. And so tonight we're going to close out that section on fulfilling the law by looking at some of Jesus' most radical and controversial statements. These are words that I think probably most of us have heard many times in church or elsewhere. And yet, when you stop to think about them, they remain as incredible and counterintuitive and difficult as ever. So, I'm going to read for us Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 48. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. So, first things first is a reminder from last week, which is that Jesus fulfilled the law through his death and resurrection, as I said, which means that we're justified through Jesus. We don't need to approach these commandments as the entrance exam for heaven. But on the other side of that coin, so we have the assurance that this is not like we have to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect to get into heaven. But on the other side of that, Jesus is showing us the new law of heaven, the law of God's kingdom. And so though we have Christ's justification to lean on and to help get us in, we also have to look at these words of Jesus and take them seriously, because this is the life that people who are part of the kingdom should be aiming for. This is the end goal. This is what we're shooting at. So everything found in the Sermon on the Mount is part of the constitution of the new kingdom, which is the metaphor that I've been using over the past month. And the ideas, the rules, and the standards for those of us who are part of God's reign. So, with that said, and that sort of friendly reminder out of the way, let's turn to what we just read. So if you remember from last week, you might recall that Jesus has a pattern that he's following here. And the pattern is, first he looks at the Old Testament law and says, you have heard that it was said, blah, blah, blah. And then he updates that law to reveal the perfect law of heaven by saying, but I tell you, and then gives the new version. And so last week we saw how Jesus changed the laws about murder and adultery and divorce and swearing oaths to include not just those outward acts, but also the inner dispositions of the heart, like anger and lust and dishonesty. And so Jesus is taking these laws and in some senses making them even harder to keep from an outer perspective, because he's dealing not just with outer acts, but the dispositions of the heart. And this week Jesus begins with, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. Now, that's another thing that most of us have probably heard plenty of times before, and it stands for as kind of the basic notion of justice in the Old Testament. So what do you do to someone else? Prepare to have that done to you in return. If you take out someone's eye, punishment is going to be you're going to lose an eye. If you punch somebody and they lose a tooth, punishment's going to be you lose a tooth. It's a pretty fair-seeming, just-seeming law on the face of it. And there's two things that I want us to know about this as we go forward, the Old Testament understanding of justice. First is that this is actually a pretty progressive sense of justice for the ancient world. In other ancient law codes and things, punishments were based not only on crimes, but also on who committed the crime. So, for example, let's say there's a slave, and that slave is killed. If somebody else's slave killed that slave, then the first slave would be put to death. But if, say, a nobleman killed another person's slave, then he wouldn't be put to death. He would have to pay the owner of the slave a fine. Or let's say that the owner of the slave killed the slave, there might be no punishment or a very light punishment. So the notion that what you do to somebody else will be done to you is pretty progressive because it actually ignores class and wealth and nationality. And in fact, in the very same passage in Deuteronomy, where it says eye for eye and tooth for tooth, at the end of it, it says, you shall treat the foreigner, I don't remember the exact words, but essentially it says, Israelites, foreigners treated the same way. So it makes it very clear that this law is not based on class or nationality or wealth. So that's kind of a tangent, but I do think it's important to recognize that God's sense of justice sort of moves ahead of where people are, even back then, even in what now sounds like an ancient sort of retributive, vengeful justice. And getting to that, talking about what kind of justice it is, the second and most important thing that I want you guys to know about Old Testament justice, and that's going to make the most difference for us, is that justice is a type of revenge or retribution. Right? The goal of justice in the Old Testament, and in most law codes and justice codes, is to do something to somebody who did something to you. Right? It's essentially revenge of a different kind, of a legal kind. And again, it seems very fair on the face of it, right? It only seems right that if somebody steals from you, that their property should be taken from them and given to you, or just taken away from them. But that is not the kind of justice that Jesus wants us to seek. Instead, what he says is, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. In Jesus' law, the very idea of revenge is abolished. Jesus wants us to forget about giving back what we get from another person, because that way never leads to true healing. To return violence for violence does not lead to healing. And so as we look at the examples that Jesus gives us, we should note that, I want to note anyway, that there are two interpretations, and I think that both of them are based in truth. And the first is that these things that we're going to look at are simply ways that we can love our enemy and a different kind of justice. And I think that is totally true. Right? Like Jesus is saying, don't think about retributive justice. Think about the ways that you can love other people. But the other part of this that is equally true when we understand the sociology of it is that these things that Jesus is going to say are also about ways of passively and peacefully resisting evil. This is one of the most overlooked parts of this passage, I think. Jesus is instructing us to do something very counterintuitive, and he's offering us a resistance manual for evil, a different way of thinking about how we respond and react to evil around us and injustice around us. Because every single one of the things that Jesus is about to mention, that we're about to look at, is being done, it's designed to dehumanize or humiliate the person that they're being done to. And so Jesus offers a way to peacefully resist those efforts and keep your dignity, your humanity, and hopefully bring some kind of reconciliation. So let's look at those things, because I think they're really important. First, Jesus says that if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek to them as well. Now, in the ancient world, a slap on the right cheek, it's important that Jesus says right cheek, because it means that it was probably a backhanded slap. People were not left-handed, or if they were, they learned to use their right hand. And so to hit somebody on the right cheek meant that you were probably backhanding them. Now, that's less about physical violence towards somebody, and it's more about a humiliation or an insult. So Jesus is saying, if you're insulted, if you're humiliated, don't slap them back. Instead, offer them the opportunity to hit the other cheek as well. Don't resist humiliation, but instead, show them that they can't take away your dignity by offering to go even lower. And another aside, and this one hasn't been totally proven to me, so I put this to you as something to take with a grain of salt. But supposedly, in the ancient world, it was seen as sort of, again, wrong or whatever to use your left hand. And so turning the left cheek to them would force somebody to either use their left hand or to punch you. And to punch was to show as, again, all this, I don't know if this is completely true, but I heard and I read as I was studying for this, that some people believe that a backhanded slap was humiliating, but a punch meant you were an equal. And so if you turned the left cheek to them, they had to either choose to treat you as an equal or to use their left hand and humiliate themselves. So anyway, take that with a grain of salt. But that's another part of it. But more importantly is giving this saying, I will not let you take away my dignity by fighting back or by reacting to this. Instead, I will turn the other cheek to you. The second example, Jesus says that if someone sues you for your shirt, offer them your coat as well. Now, it's not about just generous giving, although that's part of it, about sort of, killing with kindness, if you will. But it's also a savvy legal move. In the ancient Jewish courts, someone could take everything you own, but they couldn't take your coat. And they could take your coat, but the reason is that poor and homeless people slept in their coats. It was the one form of shelter that they had. And so it was seen as inhumane and wrong to take somebody's only form of shelter. And so if you sued somebody and you took their coat, you would have to return it to them every night so that they had a place to sleep. That was part of the law. And so there's sort of this humiliation of, you've taken this thing from me, but you have to keep bringing it back over and over again. So somebody sues you for your shirt, give them your cloak. And then the other part of this is that for most Jewish dress, there were really only two pieces. There was the undergarment and there was the overgarment. And so if somebody asks you for one and you give them the other, you're naked. You've given them both. You're standing there naked. And just like in our society, being naked is considered somewhat taboo, being naked in public. But it was seen as shameful to be somebody who caused another person nakedness. And so you heaped shame on somebody else by causing them to be naked if you sued them for one thing and they said, fine, here, just take both. So handing your cloak with your shirt is a double humiliation on the person who's doing it to you, because they have to recognize the shamefulness by making you naked and by having to come back and bring you your cloak every night to sleep in. Third, and this one is probably the most explicit one as far as passive resistance goes. Jesus says that if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. And the only people who would force you to go a mile in the ancient world, people might ask you to go a mile, but the only people who could force you to go a mile were Roman soldiers. It was law at that time that any Roman soldier could conscript any person who was under Roman occupation but not a citizen to carry their gear and supplies, but only for 1 mile. Because, these soldiers are traveling. They've got not just the armor that they're wearing, but they've got packs full of supplies and all that. So they could conscript anyone for 1 mile. But after that mile, the conscripted person was free to leave the supplies and go back to whatever they were doing. So this is not only inconvenient, but it's also a way to continue the humiliation of conquering an occupation. It's a reminder that the Romans are over you, that they are better than you, that they control what you can do, that they rule you. And so becomes this dichotomy, and again, more humiliation, dehumanization. And so people would walk the mile angrily, of course, and toss the stuff down and go home. But Jesus says then to go with them a 2nd mile. And now why would he do this? Two reasons. Again, each one of these things has sort of 2 parts to it. One is that this is a radical way to love your enemy and to serve them. To not be angry, but instead to say, you know what, I'm good, let's go mile 2. And to actually be a positive presence. But the other side of that, the second reason, is that a Roman soldier could actually get into trouble for making you go another mile. Because there's all kinds of, especially in Judea and Jerusalem around this time, there are all kinds of revolts against the Romans. And so anytime a Roman soldier would overstep their bounds, that was potentially cause for uproar and violence. And so to go the 2nd mile with them, to hit the mile marker and say, you know what, I'm going to keep going, the Roman soldier's starting to get a little nervous. Because if the commander sees that you're still there and it's been well over a mile, he's going to get really angry with you because you could cause a riot. So the Roman soldier is now forced to, in effect, beg the Jewish person to go home and not keep walking with them, because otherwise they're going to cause problems. So a person has turned the tables then and created some sort of humiliation and inconvenience for the Roman soldier instead of for themselves by going the extra mile. And then the last one that Jesus says is that do not turn away from borrowers and to give to those who ask. And this one is less about a specific type of resistance, and it's more obvious, but it's still just as important today, because being generous rather than stingy remains just as countercultural today as it was then, right? Giving more money than people ask for, or giving freely without expecting it in return, or giving to anybody who wants to borrow from you, that still remains something that we see as a terrible idea today. And so it becomes countercultural to be willing to give and to be generous, to live generously. So to sum up this whole section, we can see that Jesus is offering a brand new way for people to resist evil. Rather than responding to violence or humiliation by returning the favor, Jesus calls on his followers to find creative and nonviolent ways to oppose the evil that they encounter. And this is borne out by what Jesus says next. He says, "You've heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy,' but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Because no matter how many times you hear those words, don't they still sound a little off? Like when you really stop and think about it. Love your enemies is a phrase that we're used to hearing, but it still has the power to offend us if we stop and think about it. Because it has to make us ask tough questions. Who are my enemies, first off? Why are they my enemies, second? And am I capable of loving those people? And so earlier at the end of the Beatitudes, Jesus said that many will persecute and hate his disciples because of Jesus. And therefore, as Christians, we know that we will have enemies. But hopefully, our enemies are because of Jesus, not because of our own stupidity and sin. But identifying the enemies is less important than loving them. It's not about finding out who your enemies are, although the question should constantly be asked, who are my enemies and how can I love them? But these commandments of Jesus go hand in hand with one another. Because it's only when we learn to love our enemies that we have the power to resist them without violence, the way that Jesus was just talking about. If we continue to hate our enemies, then there's no reason to avoid violence when we resist them. If you have an enemy and you don't care about him or love him or her, then you say, who cares what happens to them? Or I'm glad they got what's coming to them if something bad happens. And we mean it, because hatred means ignoring the image of God. And that's why Jesus says that we should love our enemies and pray for our persecutors, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. That's how he finishes it. Because ignoring the image of God in another human being is to ignore that they remain your brother or sister in God. And that's why hatred and anger to our enemies constantly turns towards dehumanizing them. We have to think that our opponents or our enemies are idiots or barbarians or backwards in some way. Because if they're real, full human beings like you and I, then it's a lot harder to hate them. But seeing them as human beings, as wayward children of the same Father, forces us to come up with nonviolent ways to oppose evil, because they're still your brother or your sister. And so loving your enemies means walking 2 miles when they force you to go 1. And it means offering your coat when they take your shirt. And it means turning the left cheek when they strike the right. Because Jesus teaches his followers how to nonviolently resist their enemies, because that's how the fight is won in the long run. Violence returned by violence only creates more violence. But to treat your enemies like a brute or a barbarian, it confirms the hatred that they have for you already. And so violence and hatred just keep growing. But by acting unexpectedly, by showing love to an enemy when they expected only hate, that is a way to break the cycle. Jesus himself won the ultimate victory over death, not by leading an army, but by offering himself as a sacrifice, the ultimate sign of defeat and loss. And in that humiliation and death, Jesus opened the possibility of dignity and life for everybody. Jesus says that even the pagans and the tax collectors greet and love those who are nice to them. But to move beyond that basic human decency is what Jesus demands from us. We're to love those who love us, yes, but also those who hate us. And we're to greet those who greet us, sure, but also those who shun and humiliate us. That love is at the heart of what Jesus came to earth to do. Because all of humanity shunned God, and all of humanity had hated God, and yet God still loved us and sent his Son to defeat evil and repair the broken relationship. So Jesus' commandments to love our enemies and to not resist an evil person are connected because they reveal the only way to bring true peace and justice to the world. Violence and revenge, even righteous revenge, will never heal the wound of sin in our lives. Only love will do that. And only through nonviolent resistance will we have the opportunity to lovingly offer our enemies a chance to see their evil and to repent, to bring healing to the world. And to close, Jesus says, "Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Now, we've already sort of discussed this, but it's a fitting note to close on, because the word for perfect here can also mean complete. It's about the end goal or final aim of life. In other words, Jesus is not demanding full sinless existence from us starting right now. Instead, he's pointing the way forward. He's saying that this radical reorientation is the way to become complete, whole, and perfect. And he's reminding us of our need for him, because only through the salvation of Jesus can we put on the perfection that he offers. There's no other way to the end goal of God's kingdom than through the love that Jesus teaches us here and that he modeled with his life and his death. So may we learn how to become complete through loving our enemies, offering up nonviolent resistance to evil so that we can turn our enemies into friends and sinners into saints. And now I would like to invite Pastor Allen forward, and I would like to